Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a new feature that we've implemented that are called data updaters. This can be found on your system settings menu, and I believe that it's restricted to system administrators only. What data updaters are some optional things that you can implement in your system with just a simple click of the execute button. So for example, we have a couple of data updaters available already. One that is a new pull sheet workflow installer, and another that is a transfer workflow installer. And so that would be for transfer orders if you utilize multiple locations. These are the only ones we have available now, but we do have plans to release other ones in the future. Like I know for sure, either in the next release or the release after, we will have one for POs, because a common request that we get is a more unified PO workflow where both your rental or your purchase PO will go through certain statuses and things like that. So we're going to be implementing that in an upcoming release. But you can find all those data updaters if you just joined us on System Settings, then click Data Updaters here. Now what these do, if I were to click the Execute button on either of these, what it's going to do is actually create some new workflows in my system, and it's going to change some settings in my project element settings so that my system will now be using those new workflows. So just as a quick background to show you what I'm talking about, we're going to first click on the Projects menu, and then we'll click Workflow. And as you can see, I just have a normal pull sheet and manifest workflow. And right now I'm still in the middle of setting up this system with multiple locations, so I don't have a transfer workflow yet, but that will be good because when we do execute the transfer workflow from the data updaters, we can see exactly what happens. And so these workflows, of course, contain the actions and the different workflow jobs that you have access to when you're in a pull sheet, or when you're in a manifest. What we're going to do with these data updaters is actually execute and implement a new pull sheet workflow in this system. Now keep in mind there are a few things that you want to realize, that if you execute any of these new workflow installers, it's not necessarily going to override anything that you already have created. So that pull sheet and manifest workflow that's already created in your system, it's not going to make any changes to those or override any of those. So I know a lot of our customers do have custom workflows that they've built. We don't necessarily want people to execute these and lose all of that work that they've done if they want to revert back to the old version. In fact, that's the main reason that we implemented the data updaters on the system settings menu, is because the system is so customizable. We didn't want to force anybody to have to take these new workflows. We just wanted to give them as an option that you could execute and implement in your own system. So let's actually click on the pull sheet workflow installer. We'll click the execute button. It's going to ask, are you sure you want to execute this data updater? And I'll click yes. You can see the execution count has gone up to 1. And I did a little testing earlier where if I try to execute again, the system gives me an error that says that the maximum attempted value has been exceeded if I try to execute it again. So with these workflow installers, there will probably just be an execution count of 1. But in the future, you could probably imagine that we might have some other data updaters that aren't just workflow installers that you can execute from the data updaters tab, and you might be able to execute them multiple times. I'm not sure exactly what those will be at this point, but we do have some pretty big plans in the future for some of these data updaters, not only for easy things for you to implement as our customers, but also for easier ways for us to make changes in say, for example, a new customer system. If we're setting up transfer workflow, we could just simply execute it instead of having to go into the workflow and set up every single option, then go into project element settings and do all that. The execute does all of that work for us. But anyway, let's go back to the pull sheet workflow installer. We just executed that. We can see the execution count. Let's see exactly what it did in the system. Number one, we're going to go to Projects, then Workflow. We're going to see a couple new workflows here. Number one, we have the manifest linked workflow, and we also have the pull sheet linked workflow. If we open these up, you'll just notice, remember in the old pull sheet workflow, all you had was awaiting prep. But now in the pull sheet linked workflow, the new one, you have a bunch of other options. And we're going to show a demonstration of how this new workflow actually works in just a minute. And then the manifest linked workflow, it's pretty similar to what there was before, but there's a couple of new options here. A few other things that changed when we executed that data updater. If we go to our project element settings, and if we look both at the manifest and the pull sheet, you're going to see a couple different changes in some of the project element setting tabs. So first on the identity and exposure tab, the system automatically updated the workflow to be using the new manifest linked workflow. So this is an important place to look. If you execute one of these and realize that you don't want the new workflows, then you can come back here to the workflow section of your manifest element settings and just switch it back to the normal manifest workflow. Same thing with the pull sheet. We could open up the pull sheet project element settings and see the changes that were made there. The other thing that you might see a few changes is if you go to the status options. I can't verify which ones were and were not checked in the first place, but if there are any status option changes that need to be made, then the data updater will also do that for you. The other place that some changes were probably made, and I can't speak to the exact changes, but I do know that on the shipping and receiving options of both the pull sheet and the manifest project element settings, you're going to find a few more actions set up for both your prep and return. It's going to be using the new manifest linked workflow in those actions. And so those are just some of the places that you'll see some changes if you run that new pull sheet workflow installer. Now the big question on everyone's mind is probably, well, what on earth does that new workflow do? What's the benefit of me executing that into my system? And let's look at that right now. So I'm just going to bypass creating a quote. I'm going to go straight to creating a new pull sheet. We'll just call it the webinar test, give it some arbitrary dates. And then we could put probably even just one piece of equipment on there, just so we actually have something that can go to the manifest. Let's walk through each step in this process here and each step of the workflow as we move along that process. So nothing really has changed here. If you are still using the default workflow and you haven't made any specific changes in your own system, then when you create a pull sheet, either from scratch like how I just did, or if you create a pull sheet from a quote, it will go into the awaiting prep status. Once we go to the prep screen and actually start prepping that job, and let's just choose 2 of these barcodes. When you click Finalize, that would put the pull sheet into a different status. It would create a manifest and put the manifest into a certain status too. With the old workflow, those statuses wouldn't match. The status that the pull sheet goes into would be the final status that the pull sheet ever goes into, and it would live in that status indefinitely until you make a manual change. But what the new workflow does with these data updaters is now when I click Finalize, both the pull sheet and the manifest should be keeping the same status. So for example, we look back at our pull sheet, we can see we're now in the prepped status. If we go to the manifest, that's also in the prepped status. There are also some options in terms of shipping. So if I were to click Mark as Shipped, that would put my manifest into ship status. And then if I reopen the pull sheet is also in shipped status. And then, of course, the last step in the process would be returning. So if I go to return, let's just virtually scan both of these. When I click finalize to finalize the return, you probably guessed it, it's going to turn the manifest or change the manifest status to returned. And then the pull sheet will also have that status. And so that's the benefit of specifically this new pull sheet workflow installer. It will install a new workflow in your system that you can use so that when you go through the manifest and pull sheet statuses of a job, they will be linked together, and you don't have to go back and forth between the pull sheet and the manifest and change each of those statuses. They'll just link based on the actions that you are doing on either the pull sheet or on the return manifest. So that's what that pull sheet workflow installer does. And like I said, if you do execute it, it isn't going to erase or override. See, for example, I could still open my old pull sheet workflow and it looks just the same. I could still open my old manifest workflow and it's just as it was before. The main difference is that it created two completely new workflows, and then in the project element settings under the identity and exposure tab, that's where you'll see which workflow has been chosen to be used with that element. So again, just to reiterate that, if you execute the pull sheet workflow from the data updaters, it will change which workflow is being used from the manifest. And if you want to change that back, you could change that here. And you'd probably also want to look at some of the shipping and receiving options and make some changes back there. So it's a little bit more advanced stuff. So if you're not entirely sure that you want those new workflows, then you probably just want to stay away from running this data updater until maybe you've chatted with support and gotten some advice from them, just if you're not sure. Let's look at the transfer workflow installer as well. We're not going to go through the full process of a transfer, but I at least want to show you what happens when we do the execute action. Before we even do that, let's go to our project element settings, because I just want to show you kind of live what's happening to our transfer order element once we execute that data updater. Right now, I'm still, like I said, in the middle of setting up my transfer order element, so I haven't even assigned it a workflow yet. If I go to the data updaters and click execute for my transfer workflow installer, you can see that it's now been executed. If we go to workflow, remember I didn't even have any transfer workflow set up yet, so it just created two new transfer workflows, transfer linked and then transfer manifest linked. And then if we go back and open our transfer order project element settings, then we should see on that first tab under which workflow we're using, Flex automatically updated to be using the transfer linked workflow. And again, there are some other shipping and receiving options like the prepped action, manifest prepped action, etc. that were also changed. Now again, I'm not going to go through the full process of creating a transfer order and all of that, but we will open the workflow just so you can kind of see what the new options are and what the process is like as you're doing a transfer. It's very similar to the pull sheet and manifest workflows that we installed just 10 minutes ago. It basically gives you the option to go through the prepped, shipped, and received statuses on both the transfer order itself and on the transfer manifest, so that as you go through that process, both the transfer order and the manifest will retain their proper statuses. One question that I assume some of you might be wondering is, how come in the transfer linked workflow we have a workflow state of none? And then you notice that there are several actions available from that state of none. Reason for this is that, remember, if we go back to our project element definitions, so that's our project element settings, and if we open our transfer order, when we look at that shipping and receiving tab, the prepped action and manifest prepped action, these all have to do with what happens when you click finalize on a prep. And so when you're done prepping and that box comes up that says, do you want to finalize? And you click the finalize button, these are the things that happen. Now we're taking these actions, the actual actions that are happening, we're taking those from the none state actions here. So essentially these are just actions that are set up that we want to be able to be triggered at some point to do things, but we don't necessarily need them as actions that you can personally click on. These are just set up to be automated through the prepped action and manifest prepped action. So that's why you might see a none state with some actions that you're never going to see straight from the transfer order or the transfer manifest, but we did want to set these up just so they can be executed in some form or another through these project element settings. So like I said, we do have plans for other data updaters in the future. Right now we only have these two. And again, just to reiterate, if you do execute them, it isn't necessarily going to override, or I'm sorry, I wanted to go to workflow. It isn't necessarily going to override any of your existing workflows. It will just create a new workflow. What it will override, however, are some of the settings in your project element settings. But a lot of those are easy to go back and change back to defaults if you need to. But again, I would just be very sure that if you are making a certain change, or if you're running these data updaters, you would just want to be very sure that that's the one that you want. Because there are a few settings in the project element settings that you might not be aware of that were made changes to, and if you're not very proficient in the project element settings of either of these elements, you might not know which ones to switch back. So if you want to execute these, probably be 95% sure that you actually do want to use them as your primary new workflows. We'll be releasing a few more data updaters in the upcoming releases, and we'll explain what each of those do as we release them. But hopefully this was a good overview of what these new data updaters are, specifically these two, and what the benefits might be of using these. If you have any questions about these data updaters, specifically these two that we executed today, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com and ask any questions there.